shop. Has anybody been in that? And probably 30 or more years ago, it was just a little teepee there, but it's gradually matured over the years. And the keeper of that shop is one Mr. Philip Howard. And Philip has one of the most often looked at blogs on the island. He's got a bunch of little history tales. He's always researching something and posting it. And he's also does the ghost walks along with my wife, Amy Howard. And he's a fantastic father-in-law. So please make him welcome, Mr. Philip Howard.
Thank you, David. Alice was born in New England in 1899. Soon after she graduated from college, she procured a job in North Carolina as an assistant to the bishop, the Moravian bishop in Winston-Salem, and she moved there to Winston-Salem. As it turned out, the bishop and his wife had a son named Theodore who was almost exactly the same age as Alice. And they began courting and eventually got married sometime in the mid-1920s. In 1935, Alice's mama moved from Connecticut to North Carolina because she had been suffering from the melancholies and had not spoken for 3 solid years. In those days, withdrawal to the seashore was considered an effective cure for the melancholies, and Alice immediately began asking colleagues and friends where she should take her mama. And virtually everybody agreed, take her to Ocracoke. Ocracoke is isolated, it's far from the cares of the world. The people who live there are friendly, relaxed, and stress-free. It was the perfect place to take her mama. Well, Alice said, are there places to stay there? Oh, absolutely, they said. Aunt Mame runs a boarding house. And Alice said, well, how do I get a reservation? They said, that's just simple. Just write her a letter, tell her when you want to go, and it's as simple as that. Alice said, well, how do I address the letter? That's even simpler. Simply, Aunt Mame, Ocracoke, North Carolina. That's the only address you'll need. So Alice wrote the letter and explained that she and her husband and her mama would be coming to Ocracoke the first week in July. But it was weeks before she got a reply. And when it finally came in the mail, it was just a simple postcard. And on the back, scrawled in pencil, were just these few words. Aunt Mame ain't taking folks no more. You can stay with me, Uncle Gary. And they knew right away that they were going to love this place. So on the appointed day, they were ready. They got Alice's mom in the car and the luggage packed, and they drove down to Atlantic, North Carolina, because they were going to have to take the Mailboat from Ocracoke or from Atlantic over to Ocracoke. It made one round trip daily. This was before there were car ferries to Ocracoke in 1935. So they stayed overnight at a boarding house in Atlantic. The next day at noon, they were down at the docks watching as they were loading big blocks of ice into the hold of the Mailboat Aletha. After that went the mail bags and then some freight, and finally it was time to board the passengers. Alice and Theodore handed their brand new leather luggage to the deckhand, and he simply tossed it into the hold along with everything else. And finally, Alice and Theodore looked at them and said, why in the world would you treat our new luggage so poorly? And the deckhand said, that's to help keep the ice from melting, of course. They boarded the Mailboat, and about 1 o'clock, it motored away from the dock out into Core Sound. And after 2 hours, they were far from the mainland and still not within sight of Ocracoke, when Alice's mama turned to her and spoke the first words she had uttered in 3 years. Alice, she said, where in the hell are you taking me? Finally, they pulled into the dock at Ocracoke, and Alice and Theodore immediately started exploring the island, the village, and getting to know the people who lived here. They absolutely fell in love with Ocracoke. They were only supposed to spend 1 week here. They extended it to 2, and then finally to 3 weeks. At the end of the 3rd week, they discovered that there was a 100-year-old cottage on Ocracoke that was for sale, and without ever stepping inside of it, they purchased it. They were both school teachers, and for the next 13 years, they spent every summer on Ocracoke. In 1948, they both quit their jobs in Clemens, North Carolina, and moved to Ocracoke permanently. They both had jobs at the school here, and they made this their permanent home. They lived here for the rest of their lives. Both Alice and Theodore are buried in the community cemetery on Ocracoke. Alice always said, once you get Ocracoke sand between your toes, you will always want to come back. And if you're really lucky, someday you might be able to call Ocracoke home. Well, my father was born on Ocracoke in 1911, but he left the island when he was just 16 years old to go up north to work. But every summer he brought his family back to Ocracoke. And that's how it came to be that I made my very first trip on the same mailboat that Alice and Theodore came on in 1945 when I was not quite 1 year old. The Mailboat Aletha was a 42-foot wooden vessel powered by a diesel engine. It had a 28-foot passenger cabin. And I actually brought a picture of it over here so you can see what it looks like. It was designed to hold about 24 passengers, but in those days the only regulation the Coast Guard had was that there had to be a life vest on board for every passenger on board the vessel, and Captain George O'Neill was known to carry as many as 60 people across the Sound in that vessel. You can see that it sits very low in the water. When it had 60 passengers and freight, it sat even lower in the water. The best seats were on two wooden benches above the aft cabin. There was a canvas awning over top that allowed you to get the sea breeze but not be out in the direct sunlight. But if you weren't lucky enough to get one of those seats, you just had to make do however you could, either sitting on an old fish box or get your luggage up out of the hold and sit on that. It was just a marvelous little boat, really a marvelous boat. You also notice that there are no railings on the vessel, and I know that there were a number of people that fell overboard on the passage. They were all rescued, and I'm virtually certain that alcoholic beverages were involved in each one of those incidents. When I was 5 years old, I made my very last trip on the Mailboat Aletha because the next year Fraser Peel ran a car ferry across Hatteras Inlet, and we began coming that way. But at least I was old enough to remember the trip, and I had brought a little wooden boat that was attached with a string. This part of the story is actually for all the parents and grandparents in the audience. My mama let me sit on the stern of that vessel with my legs hanging over and my feet splashing in the wake of the mailboat, pulling that little wooden boat behind the boat. And you will all notice that I am still alive. When we got closer to Ocracoke, the channel gets narrower and shallower. And at one point, Captain George ran aground on a shoal, and he tried his best to back the Aletha off the shoal, and he was not successful. But he had a plan. He just asked all the men to jump overboard. That lightened the vessel, and they were also able to push. And once they got out into deeper water, they all jumped back on the boat. And as a 5-year-old, I just thought that was a marvelous adventure to watch my dad jump overboard and then clamber back up on top. When we finally got into the harbor at Ocracoke and pulled up at the mailboat dock, virtually the entire village was there waiting. It was the main social event of the day, was to meet the Mailboat Aletha. It was an opportunity to see what family and friends were coming back to the island for the summer. It was also an opportunity to see if there were any strangers coming to Ocracoke. So everybody waited as barefooted teenage boys ran down the docks and grabbed the canvas mail bags and took them into the post office. And the postmaster and her assistants then would sort the mail. And that gave everybody a chance to share stories and gossip and tales about Ocracoke and talk to folks that had just arrived. When the mail was finally sorted, the postmaster would come out and she would hold up a letter or a package and call out the person's name. And if they were present, they would just pass the mail down to whoever was there. And once everybody present had gotten their mail, then she'd take the mail back into the post office, to box up for the next day. And that was the cue for everybody to walk back home and have their evening dinner. And so my mother and my father and my brother and my grandmother and grandfather, we would walk down these little sand lanes to my grandmother and grandfather's house where we would spend the summer. And it was a magical, magical time in the late 1940s and early 1950s to spend a summer on Ocracoke as a young boy. But when I was a child, I never really thought about this. It was only later when I realized that Alice was absolutely right. If you get that Ocracoke sand between your toes, you will always want to come back. And if you're lucky like I've been, you will eventually perhaps get to call Ocracoke home. Thank you.